The rise and fall of economies has always been very closely tied to access to abundant energy. In fact, the correlation between GDP and energy consumption per capita is so close it's almost the same thing. This relationship makes sense. Energy is what allows humans to outsource their labor to focus on more productive tasks. When humanity found biofuel, burning wood, we were able to outsource the labor of looking for more food to cooking it and getting more nutrients out of it, using that fire to warm our bodies so we didn't have to expend as many calories. We could do more productive tasks like building better shelters. When we harnessed the energy of animals, we were able to offload, outsource some of that energy and have animals work our fields. Discovering coal allowed us to outsource human labor to things like machines, tractors, steam engines, massively increasing productive output. And today, our oil-based global industry that transports and creates and is the materials for basically everything we use today is what has allowed us to create so much wealth and prosperity and access to cheap necessities worldwide. It makes sense then that if you are able to somehow tie your value to the value of oil, which is the predominant source of energy today, that would be beneficial for you. And in fact, it was the US tying the value of the dollar to oil that gave the United States one of the greatest advantages in history, maintaining control over the global reserve currency. Over the last 50 years, this peg or this tie between the value of oil and the dollar is one of the things that has given the US the ability to maintain the dollar as the global reserve currency. Today we call this the petrodollar. So how did this happen and why is it about to change? To understand the origins of the petrodollar, we go back to World War II. During World War II, most countries on Earth were completely out of money. Before that, they had been on a gold standard, they spent it all for the war efforts, and the United States was on the receiving end of a lot of that spending. That meant the US had basically the entire world's stockpile of gold. And so at the end of the war, the countries got together at the Bretton Woods meeting and decided, hey, we don't want to start over from scratch. We want to continue from where we're at. So instead of starting over and pegging our currency to gold, which we don't have, let's just peg our currency to the dollar. We can redeem our currency with the dollar, and the dollar we can redeem for gold. And the dollar as the global reserve currency was born. We all know that from that time for the next few decades up until the 70s, the United States consistently printed too many dollars, and they used those dollars to buy stuff from the rest of the world. But in 1967, this arrangement started to collapse as European central banks started stockpiling gold because they didn't believe the US had enough gold to continue to back the dollar. Obviously, the rest of the world was right, and in 1971, the US had to leave the gold standard forever. And at this point, there was nothing keeping the rest of the world from dumping dollars. And in fact, that's what the world started doing. And that's why the price of gold over the following 3 years went up almost 300%, as the dollar was being devalued as the rest of the world just didn't want it anymore. By the way, if you are looking for a way to be able to protect yourself, invest your portfolio in a way where you don't have to be worried about changes in global reserve currencies, whether you're overexposed or underexposed to inflation or deflation, you need to sign up for Heresy Financial University. A membership gives you access to all my training programs, my courses, my guides, linked in the description below. It's also important to note that at this point, the so-called Eurodollar system was already in place. Basically, the world had spent the last 30 years using dollars for international trade, making banking establishments and systems for payment with dollars. So it would have been a hard thing for the world to completely dump dollars. Now, the value of dollars was declining because there was nothing of real value continuing to back them up. And so left alone, it's possible that the rest of the world would have continued to just dump dollars for good. But there was some friction there because the rest of the world still kind of wanted to use dollars. And this is the origin of the petrodollar. The United States recognized if they didn't do something, then the value of the dollar would continue to decline. It would cease to be circulated as the global reserve currency, and the United States would lose most, if not all, of their massive advantage on the global stage of power. Add on top the fact that in the early 70s, Saudi Arabia contributed to an oil embargo against the United States and in Europe. This meant that it was becoming more and more expensive for the United States to get oil from the rest of the world, which is where it got most of its oil from at the time. So the US decided to kill two birds with one stone. They secured a deal with Saudi Arabia. In 1975, the United States and Saudi Arabia signed a wide-ranging agreement on economic and military cooperation, which included $2 billion worth of military contracts and the US sending Saudi Arabia 60 fighter jets. Essentially, the US promised to use its military power to defend Saudi Arabia in exchange for Saudi Arabia pricing oil in dollars, so that if anyone in the world wanted to get oil, they would have to first get dollars. With the systems already in place for the world already using dollars, and now the fact that you had to get dollars to get oil, this secured the dollar's place as the global reserve currency for decades to come. But people have known for a while that if this system ever changed, where if countries around the world no longer needed to get dollars in order to get oil, then this could slowly erode the power that the US has with the dollar as the global reserve currency. Ron Paul has stated that we will know that day is approaching when oil producing countries demand gold or its equivalent for their oil rather than dollars or euros. And well, looks like that day might actually be here. In 2022, President Xi Jinping of China visited Riyadh to boost coordination on energy policy. Xi said that he wanted to buy more oil from the Middle East and wanted to settle that oil in yuan. Given the last 50 years, one might expect Saudi Arabia to say, no, we need dollars. However, they said they enjoy a very strategic relationship with China and with other nations like the US, stating that there are no issues with discussing how they settle their trade arrangements, that they are not ruling out anything. Now, I get it. There's a big difference between actually moving forward with something and just saying we're not ruling anything out. But Saudi Aramco is now in a deal with Chinese partners to build a refinery, and the construction is expected to start in the second quarter. So this relationship is strengthening. Meanwhile, the relationship between Saudi and the United States is weakening. There are some strong objections to this though, mainly that producers of oil don't actually want yuan. It is true that most Gulf oil producers just don't want to do that. And if the people who are producing something don't want to sell it for one thing, it seems like deal is done. Then if you want to get it from them, you have to pay them with what they're asking for, right? So petrodollar is here to stay, right? Well, it seems as if China is aware of this. They understand that the rest of the world, especially oil producers in the Arab Gulf, don't actually want to keep and hold yuan. Doug Casey points out this is the reason why China has such a large gold stash. The Shanghai International Energy Exchange has a crude oil futures contract denominated in yuan. And because China knows that nobody else really wants to hold yuan, China has explicitly linked the crude futures contract with the ability to convert yuan into physical gold. Just a few years ago, many people would have said all of this is preposterous. Absolutely no way it could ever happen. But the funny thing about a global reserve currency is you can use it as a weapon. The problem is it's just the kind of weapon you can only fire once. It is evident now that sanctions on Russia have been shifting the power of energy away from the West towards the East. And it is becoming commonplace for many countries around the world to not use dollars in order to get energy, not because they didn't want to, but because Russia can't take dollars. So in order to punish Russia, we have cut them off from dollars, meaning that many countries around the world now have to get other currencies in order to get their energy needs met instead of dollars. So here's a quick summary. Number one, the United States makes sure the world needs dollars in order to get oil. This means that the dollar is the global reserve currency, which gives the United States a lot of power. Fast forward roughly 50 years, and the United States decides to use that power as a weapon. That causes countries around the world to no longer be able to use dollars to get their energy needs fulfilled. Meanwhile, relationships between countries like China and Saudi Arabia are strengthening. And at any point, the petrodollar could evaporate into thin air as fast as it came into being. And the key thing here is you wouldn't need for a petro yuan to replace it, because nobody wants to hold yuan, which is why China is giving the explicit ability to have that converted into gold. The time scale on this is not clear. The currency or basket of currencies or commodity or digital money that replaces the dollar as the global reserve currency is also not yet known. Obviously, nobody has a crystal ball for the future, but the days are numbered for the dollar maintaining its position as the global reserve currency linked to oil, as the United States sours its relationship with many countries around the world. Power shifts from the West to the East, and nations become concerned that they could get the same treatment as Russia, which means it's a question of when, not a question of if. And just as happened in 1971, when this change took place and the price of gold took off, you can bet that there will be very similar action. If the world needs to suddenly get gold in order to pay for oil and no longer needs dollars anymore, gold might suddenly become a lot more valuable, which might be why central banks are currently buying more gold than they've bought since 1967. And if that date sounds familiar, it's because that's when the London gold pool collapsed, the last time central banks saw a move like this coming. As always, really appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.